Welcome to another edition of Football Insiders. There's some teams right now that have one regular season game left. I can smell the playoffs. It's just in the future, but we've still got a lot of important football games to talk about. Michael McCleary here from Argus Leader Media, Jason Andera, Midco Sports, and we're here to talk about high school football. How are you doing, Michael?
I'm doing pretty good.
Wait, I called you Michael McCleary.
Yeah, you did.
Michael McCleary.
That's a combination of mine and my boss's name, which is, that's just about as creative we got it on this show so far. So
we'll go with it, Michael McCleary. So how are you doing, Michael?
I'm doing pretty good. We talked about last week how the weather was getting a little bit colder, and it's stayed a little bit warm over the past couple days. So, hard not to be in a good mood.
Yeah. Well, let's do some takeaways from last week, and we'll start in the big schools and work our way down to 9-man football and 11 AAA last week. The big game everybody wanted to talk about is Roosevelt and Jefferson. Those two teams, had this built-in rivalry ready to go in their first game ever. It lived up to the hype in the first half, and in the second half, Roosevelt just pulled away. What were your takeaways from that game? Yeah,
Roosevelt just was able to get the run game going, and that has been sort of an uphill battle for them all year long. Tyree Nave has been really, really good, but also Nelson Wright, has been, coming alive for them in the past couple weeks, and, we saw the best of both of them in that game. Tyree Nave obviously had the more scores in the game. I believe he had 4 touchdowns, yes. But Nelson Wright, he ran for over 160 yards as well. So, if Roosevelt's able to establish the run game, it's hard to imagine that, a lot of people will be able to compete with them in that regard because, their defense is able to get stops. Obviously, we saw Asmar Muhammad get a interception sort of late in the game, almost to seal it at that point. Yep. So, they're going to be able to get stops, and if they keep the opposing offenses from getting the ball, as they did with Jefferson last week, especially when Talon Ashley was making every play that he could, at least early in the game. They're going to be a tough team to beat.
It was interesting for me too, just to hear Kim Nelson before the game and after the game. This is an easygoing guy, but you could tell this one weighed a little bit more on him, and not because it was Jefferson, but because they were at a tipping point this season. They needed a win against a good team, and they got that win against a good team. Now we'll have to see, does that carry the momentum through, or does that just put them at that level where they can beat a team, but they're not going to do it consistently? We'll see how consistent they are from here on out.
Yeah, this game was always going to have some level of importance. Kim Nelson said after the game that both schools have been trying to play it down a little bit, and granted the game was, obviously it never got bad at any point. It was extreme, like a lot of mutual respect from both sides. Right. Like it was, it was a hard fought game, and that's what you would hope from something like this. But this was always going to be, just based on where Roosevelt stood at this point, it was always going to be an extremely important game for them. And, whether they won or lost really would determine what was going to happen for the rest of the year because, Kim Nelson said, he didn't want to get to, the playoffs, be 1-8 and say, oh, we finally figured it out. So exactly. Now that they're finally figuring it out now, that's a good thing for them going forward.
I also want to touch on another big game from last week. Brandon Valley grinds out another win at home. They did it against Lincoln this time. Lincoln came back toward the end of the game, weren't quite able to chop into that lead, but Brandon Valley, they just run the ball again. Jordan Johnson had another big week, 185 yards on the ground. He was the workhorse. We've seen a couple different guys run the ball for them. This is another case of the team that can run the ball late in the season. Seems like they're getting it done.
Yeah, Brandon Valley is pretty remarkable where, the question with them over the past couple weeks is, can they score? They really haven't gotten really on the scoreboard very much, but when Lincoln scores 22, they score 25, So, exactly. It almost doesn't matter what the opposing team comes with. Like, Brandon Valley's just going to get that little bit more. And, to be honest, I don't think we could really say anymore that, Brandon Valley is maybe offensively challenged or anything like that because, their offense is able to respond to whatever the opposing offense gives. And obviously the defense, does a really, really good job of limiting, to what the offense can provide. But, you know, the way that they run the ball, you know, they kind of take the life out of the opposing offense. And that, you know, defensively and offensively, they're just like sort of in sync in that regard.
Yeah. They are fifth, Brandon Valley is right now, in point differential in 11 AAA. I mean, this is a team that is in it for close games, but they have won every single game that they've put up so far this year. And with that, let's take a look at this week's games. Not a ton of marquee matchups, but you always have a couple good games in 11 AAA. And I think this week the one to look at is Roosevelt at Washington. Washington coming off of a confidence-building win against Brookings where they pulled away in the second half. Roosevelt coming off of a confidence-building game where they pulled away in the second half. There's some real momentum going with the winner of this game.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Roosevelt is trying to string together 2 wins for the first time all season, and you know, Washington, you know, is looking to kind of get back to sort of the upward trajectory that they were having in the beginning of the season. You know, they're another team that defends really well and runs the ball really well. So it's going to be interesting who comes apart in that matchup, because both of them are trying to limit the possession time for the opposing offense. So you know, that's really going to be interesting. Who does that better is really going to be who comes out on top, because I think Roosevelt's proved that, you know, they do that game plan well enough where they'll stick with people.
Yeah, I was impressed with the way that they stayed with that running plan. That's 3 weeks in a row now. You talked about Nelson Wright. 3 weeks in a row, he's been over 100 yards. Tyree Nave had a career day. So they've got a 2-headed monster at running back. Washington has their own 2-headed monster. Elijah Tenaya has been on fire lately. And Blessing Tenaya, another guy who's coming off of an injury, is still able to give him some respite and also get some good yards. And he got a touchdown last week. So 2 very good offensive lines, 2 very good running backs on each team going at it. That should be fun.
Yeah, and you know, Blessing's injury, while Washington's definitely glad to have him back and, you know, playing at full speed, you know, it really gave Elijah an opportunity to show what he could do. And you know, how Washington splits up those reps for the rest of the year, it could sort of be a Roosevelt thing where, you know, you could limit Blessing a little bit and just have Elijah take over games that he's the hot hand. You could go with that hot hand approach, and that's always a good thing to have, you know, on your team going down the stretch.
Yeah, and Roosevelt goes with more of they're literally alternating possessions, at least to start out this game. In most games, you see Tyree Nave start the first possession, Nelson Wright gets the next one. Tyree, Nelson, and that's been working well for them, keeping them fresh and also helping them get into a rhythm. So I like what Roosevelt's doing there. Some more games this week. Stevens at O'Gorman. Stevens had that win early in the year against Roosevelt. They're still looking for you know, more quality wins. This is an opportunity for them to go on the road and play an O'Gorman team. And O'Gorman, I'll tell you what, they've played right with Lincoln. They've played, you know, they beat Roosevelt earlier this year. They've played right with teams left and right, but they are not getting the victories to go with it. But we know every year that this coaching staff gets O'Gorman ready by the end of the season.
Yeah, and this is a good turnaround opportunity for O'Gorman, because, you know, they got that win over Roosevelt in week 1, and, you know, O'Gorman looked pretty strong. I mean, they were good defensively, and, you know, almost similar to some of these defensive-minded teams that we've been talking about earlier, where, you know, they just got just enough. And, you know, Roosevelt obviously didn't play its best football at that time. You know, they probably haven't come into their best football until the last couple weeks.
Right.
But, you know, O'Gorman's been in some close ones, and O'Gorman has some playmakers on their team. So, you know, this is a really, really good opportunity for, you know, them to get a win that sort of propels them towards the rest of the year.
Yeah, Bennett Dannenbring last week had his best quarterbacking of the season, going 13 of 14. Couple touchdowns throwing, 1 running. He had a good week against Central. Brandon Valley takes on Mitchell. Mitchell struggling a little bit this year. I mean, we expect Brandon Valley to go in and be able to physically dominate that game. We've got Rapid City Central at Harrisburg. Again, Central just struggling getting into any kind of rhythm there. And Harrisburg, of course, you know, had a much better week last week against Stevens and put that game away early and kept them from making that a close one. So the first time Harrisburg's had a game like that where they haven't had to sweat one out in the fourth quarter. They get Central this week. And then Saturday at Howard Wood Field, we'll see how Jefferson bounces back. We'll see how Lincoln bounces back. 2 teams with 2 losses. And just like that Washington Roosevelt game, the winner of that game is going to feel pretty good on a roll. Well, the loser of this game is going to have a 2-game losing streak. Jefferson and Lincoln, what do you think?
Yeah, this is tough because, both these wins, whichever way it goes, would be a quality win for the other team. So, I mean, Jefferson clearly showed that, they belong sort of in the upper echelon, which is why you don't overreact to such a lopsided loss last week. But, Lincoln, had a little bit easier of a front part of the schedule. They're entering their toughest stretch of the schedule right now, but I think that front part of the schedule was a lot more difficult than I guess we thought coming into the year, and I think Lincoln thought coming into the year, and they got through that pretty well. So I mean, I think Lincoln's a really good team, and I think that this is going to be a really close game, and if Lincoln can pull this out, I mean, maybe they sort of belong within that top 3 or 4.
I feel like Lincoln has they have the ability defensively. They've got the power. And these two teams match up very similarly to me as far as, they're not going to beat you down with the running game. They're going to find some big plays in the passing game, and their defenses are opportunistic. It's going to be a lot of fun to see how that plays out. Just before we leave 11 AAA, these last couple weeks, I just want to talk about if the playoffs started today, what the matchups would look like. And I've got a graphic up here I'm going to put up. It would be Stevens at Brandon Valley, Washington at Lincoln, O'Gorman at Jefferson. That would be a really good game. And then Roosevelt at Harrisburg. I mean, you look at those games and you feel like anything could happen in that scenario.
Yeah, and we get a rematch of maybe the most exciting game that Harrisburg has played.
Yeah.
So that's really exciting, and
I expect those to jumble, but it's interesting to see this as we go out.
Yeah, for sure, and I'm really excited about that Harrisburg Roosevelt game, but O'Gorman Jefferson, that's that's a great game as well. I mean, those are two teams that are sort of in the middle of the pack, and the plays that Taylor Ashley was making the other day. I mean, it's almost unfair that it was such a lopsided game that doesn't get discussed about as much, because he made some deep throws to Griffin Wilde that I don't know if any other quarterback in the state can do that.
It was ridiculous, and I think that puts him on the radar as a potential college quarterback. I mean, he's so quick, and he can make throws from so many different angles.
Yeah.
He's ridiculous.
Yeah, and he took a visit to SDSU recently, and I would think SDSU is smart to keep an eye on him.
Yep, just a junior. We'll see what he does. Let's move on to 11 AA, and our takeaways from last week. Lincoln Kienholz, for those of you who didn't check this out, 8 passing touchdowns, 1 rushing touchdown in one half of play against Huron. Huron's a team that has a couple wins in 11 AA. It was absolutely amazing, and he hooked up with 2 long passes with Jack Merkwan. Merkwan had 4 touchdowns in that game. The offense was opportunistic. The field position all went in their favor, and they got a huge lead on Huron. Didn't even have to play him the second half. He was amazing, and it just makes me wonder, are we sleeping a little bit on Pierre? And Michael, you've been a champion for the Govs all season long, saying, hey, they lost to Harrisburg early, but keep an eye on these guys.
Yeah, and this was the statement win. You come into a matchup where these are games that Pierre has played relatively close throughout the year. They've obviously
a couple close ones,
they've won handily in most of their games, but against some of the better opponents in AA, I mean, they've a close game for Pierre is like 3 touchdowns. Let's be real. But these are the types of games where Pierre hasn't necessarily just blown somebody out of the water. But this was one of the games that they did, and T has had a couple of those games this year, and I think that's one of the reasons why people keep on hyping T up as the best team in AA, and I think there's merit to that for sure. I saw T play, and T is fantastic. But you can't knock Pierre for that first week loss against Harrisburg. They're a really good team. Obviously, Kienholz is probably the best quarterback in that class, if not the best player. But they're going to be really good, and they're going to be a really tough matchup for any playoff team come the end of the season.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. Let's take a look at this week's matchups. Aberdeen, losers of 3 out of their last 4, I believe. They take on T Area, the toughest game they'll have all season long. this Aberdeen team has fallen off a little bit, and T area has definitely not.
Yeah, T has their identity. They run the ball, and they're sticking with it, and it's working. T is one of the more impressive teams that I've seen. I mean, we talk about some of the best players on every respective team. It's hard to know who's the best running back on T.
Yeah.
They have several guys. I mean, Jackson Weber, Nathan Babb takes some running plays for them.
Chase Van Tol has been unbelievable.
Yeah, and they all sort of have different running styles, but they could all break the long one. I mean, like Chase Van Tol is more of a power back, whereas Jackson Weber is.
Yeah, he's speed, man.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've seen a faster player in high school sports so far. It's pretty remarkable how they run the ball, and they have. I was talking to head coach Craig Clayberg about this a couple weeks ago. He said he doesn't like the spin move, and I said, is that something that you practice? Because I mean, it's remarkable that he has 4 guys that could do a perfect spin move. Yeah. Something that my high school team, I don't know if there's a single person on that team could do a spin move and maintain their balance. But he's got a lot of running backs to work with, and he puts those guys all over the field. They line up in the slot, they line up wide. He's just got a ton of weapons, and T's really good. But we talked about Aberdeen, and Aberdeen is. They saw their moment at the beginning of the season where they looked like one of those teams.
Yeah, their game against Yankton, I mean, Sam Rolfe's put on a show, and since then, it's been tougher. It's been a tougher go. Rolfe's has been shut down a little bit. I think the tape on them is to take away Merksbauer and make them run the ball on you, and they just have not been able to do that yet so far. So they're going to try to regroup against T area. Really a litmus test game. Watertown at Pierre. Watertown fresh off of a 30-0 win over Aberdeen, and now they take on Pierre. They didn't play very well a couple weeks ago against T. They get another shot against one of the elite teams in 11AA.
Yeah, and Watertown is one of those teams that's sort of beaten those Aberdeens and beaten those teams that are sort of trending down in the class. And because of how well T played them the other week, Pierre to come out and play them in a similar way, I think that's sort of that strengthens the argument that Pierre is right there with T. And obviously T is the only undefeated team left. Right. But Pierre with that one loss being AAA, I mean, they just got to keep on making impressions against AA opponents. That's really all they could do because they don't play T during the regular season. Right. So, that's the way that they have to kind of prove that they're that #1 team. And I think this week is a really, really big game, towards that goal.
I couldn't agree more. More games on the schedule for AA. Brookings takes on Huron. Both teams coming off a loss. Brookings, I mean, played really well in a half a play against Washington. They just couldn't hold down the long runs by Elijah Tanaya and let that game slip away. Huron, had won a couple weeks ago, got beat pretty good last week by Pierre. They'll be looking for revenge. And then Brookings Huron, always a rival game as well. And then Sturgis takes on Yankton. Sturgis got a big win last week against Belle-Fourche, and Connor Burnt really ran the ball well for them. But Yankton, I think they're one of those teams that still has the potential to work their way up to not only a semifinal game, but threaten to get back to the Dome.
Yeah, and I have to give credit to Brookings. They were tied after 3 quarters with Washington, and obviously that 4th quarter Washington just broke away. But I mean, you got to really give a ton of credit for how they played against a completely different class opponent.
We talked to Ryan Evans, and were you with me, or was it Zimmer?
I think it was Zimmer. Yeah.
Okay, but Ryan Evans was very complimentary to the Brookings coaching staff and said, every time they'd make a defensive play against what they were running, the defensive coaches on Washington were like, yep, that's exactly what we would have done. That's exactly how we would have defended that. So they were very impressed by Brookings.
Yeah, I mean, Brookings has proved it in AA, and I really think that those 3 quarters sort of proved it in AAA as well. Obviously they don't come out with that win, and it doesn't really seem that close on the scoreboard, but the way that they played them for 3 quarters, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Washington sort of, took something from that game in a game that they're supposed to sort of win.
Yeah, that's very true. That's a look at 11AA, and quickly, I was going to put up the 11AA if they started right now, the playoff scenario. You'd have Mitchell at T area, Huron, Watertown, Yankton Brookings, that's an interesting one. That's a 6-3 matchup right now. And then Aberdeen Central has fallen all the way down to 7 in the power points. They'd have to play Pierre. They play coming up next week in Aberdeen. So just interesting to keep an eye on that. Yankton Brookings, that'd be a good one.
Yeah, really good.
They played last year at this time too, and that didn't go very well for Yankton in the playoffs last year. Let's move on to 11A. Canton and West Central. Our shooter who went to watch that game, David Brown, said, wow, 6-0. It wasn't the most exciting game in the world, but Canton got it done on a blocked kick where they recovered it in the end zone, a blocked punt actually in the end zone, got the win. Their special forces gets it done when the offense wasn't. So I think it did show one thing, that Canton and West Central are pretty close to each other. Yeah,
and I think this, Canton was probably looking to separate themselves a little bit, and I don't think they did. Obviously when you shut a team out, that's always a big deal, but, West Central was really close to shutting them out too. So, it was one of those games where, both defenses impressed, and it just, the score was the score at the end of the game. I mean, it was practically a tie.
It was practically a tie, and this Canton team has played West Central so close over the last, all last year. They played twice too, and those were two really close games. Canton didn't play their best, but West Central has a lot to hang their hat on. They did very well defensively to shut down the power running game of Canton. So I think both those two teams come out of that game and say, hey, we are potential contenders in 11A. Vermilion got a quality win over Dells. They got a huge lead in that game. Dells came back, almost trimmed the lead, but couldn't quite get it done. And Vermilion, I mean, you look at the standings right now, they're the one team who didn't start out the year, on the radar, who's, I think they're third in seed points right now, tied with West Central. They're having a really good year.
Yeah, and Vermilion was outside of the top 5 in the media poll last week, and Del Rapids was, I believe, at 3. And that these these are the games that Vermilion sort of has to win for the rest of the year, and they've been playing really well. I think they took a loss in a couple weeks ago
to Madison, and that's one that you're going to have a tough time in, and then they lost to Canton. They lost to basically the two best teams in the class.
Oh, right. They had that really, really tough stretch 2 weeks in a row where, they just, basically got a bad draw against the two best teams in the class. But, Vermilion's a really good team, and I think they're going to show against maybe not those top 2 teams that,
They get a test this week. They get to play West Central. And as we take a look at this week's games, I think that one and the Del Rapids Madison game, we've got two really, this is like a potential Final Four without Canton in the in 11A this week. And West Central, if they can go into Vermilion and get a win, that's huge. If Vermilion can somehow take out West Central, we go back 20 years, and this was what 11A was all about. West Central, Vermilion, those are the only two teams winning championships at the time. This game is actually important. It's been a while since these two teams have been right at the top of 11A.
Yeah, and West Central obviously wants to come and score points this week.
Yeah.
And Vermilion,
after a shutout, they want to score points.
Yeah,
for sure.
and Vermilion has been a great offense this year so far. So it's this will be a really interesting test for West Central, and obviously for Vermilion as well, if they want to keep their upward climb.
Yeah, and then we've got Del Rapids at Madison. That's the game we're going to have here on Midco. We're going to do some 11A. I'm really excited to do that, and I talked to Max Hodgen yesterday of Madison. He's really excited about this team and how they've gotten back to running the football, and it's been a couple years since Madison's had a ground game quite like this. I asked him how they compare to some of the championship teams they've had over his time. They've won several championships, and he goes, we don't have those top-end players, but we have a lot of really good players, and Nate Rickey has done a great job quarterbacking, and he's a coach's son. He's been around the game a lot, and he's really showing it this year. He's throwing and running the ball. So I expect Del Rapids Madison to be one of those drag-them-out fights. It should be fun. Let's move to 11B. Some takeaways from last week. Bridgewater Emory Ethan loses to Beersford. And Beersford, we talked about all these one-loss teams and all these top teams in 11B. Beersford wasn't among those teams that we talked about, and they knocked out Bridgewater, Emory, Ethan. I think that just shows how close this class is. Another close game last week, Sioux Valley, Elk Point, Jefferson. 2 of those one-loss teams went at it, and that was back and forth until the very end when Parker Pitts found a way to bail his team out. And I think that's the X factor, is if you have a player like Parker Pitts, you have a chance to win the game. He's always throwing and running for over 100 yards. He's been a lot of fun to watch. And then this week, another battle for Bridgewater, Emory, Ethan. They play Elk Point, Jefferson. We'll see if they can bounce back off the mat. And of course, we didn't mention Winter, but that's a team that had their biggest test, one of the biggest tests of the year last week, and they passed with flying colors. A nice win for the Warriors. Caden Keyser had an outstanding day, 3 touchdowns rushing. They've just, we don't even talk about Winter anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned how close the class is, because the battle starts at number 2 on. Right. 1 isn't close.
It isn't right now. I wonder if that could shrink. I don't think it probably will.
I mean, we talked about how this was a test going up against Woonsocket, Western Union Spring, Sanborn Central. They won 32-0. I mean, this is
7-0 at half, though. Just
okay, and
it was a glimmer of hope for
and if we're going to give credit to Brookings for how they played Washington, I think we should also do the same for Woonsocket. But
can't last with a team like Winter. They're just so physical.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, for 4 quarters, can you really expect any team to really stick with them? I mean, you hope that there's good matchups in the playoffs, but at the same time, it really seems like a lot of these teams, are fighting really, really hard for second place.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Moving on to 9-man football. Some of the classes in 9-man, we had some interesting games last week. Hanson trying to stay unbeaten in 9AA. They did. They got a win over Chester area, scored a go-ahead touchdown in the final minutes of the game, and then Chester missed a field goal on the way back. It just tells me Chester belongs in the conversation still. They're kind of my dark horse this year, and I'm still with them. I still think this Chester area team could cause some real chaos in the playoffs in 9AA, but you have to give credit to Hanson. They stayed at number 1. They have an unbelievably tough schedule down the stretch as they take on Canastota this week. And I believe, I didn't look, I think they have Garrettson the following week. I'll have to double check that. But Hanson has 2 of their toughest games coming up in the next 2 weeks here. This week, I want to see what Howard does at Garrettson. Garrettson in 9AA have been ranked most of the year, has kind of fallen maybe off the elite contender list, but they feel like a win here against Howard could put them right back.
Yeah, I mean, they're sitting at 4-2 right now. That's a pretty solid record, especially in this class where you got a couple teams with 1 win at the top, but then it's just a bunch of 2 and 3 loss teams.
I mean, and they're good. There's some good teams in that, and somebody's going to separate themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Garrettson and all the way down to Ipswich and Lyman, who there were.
Lyman is the number 1 seed right now, and they're not ranked.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I mean, there's 6 teams who are receiving votes in this class, which is way more than any other class. So I mean, there's a bunch of those teams. This is basically a top 10 instead of a top 5 list. So
really good.
Yeah, there's a ton of really good teams in this class, and it's going to be really, really close. And obviously, you like to see that Hanson is holding on, but with how Chester area played them, I mean, Hanson is sort of on a shaky foundation a little bit, but you can't blame him because a lot of teams being at that top spot would be.
Yeah, and Garrettson in that mix, they take on Howard. Howard has been dominant, but they're in 9A. The other 9AA game I wanted to talk about is Hanson and Canastota. Canastota Freeman still a very good team. They've had the toughest schedule of anybody. They've lost a few. They've looked better coming out, and they're definitely a threat to take out Hanson this week, so that'll be a lot of fun. Another game on the radar for me, Potter County has been climbing up the 9B rankings. Could they be a contender? If they can play against Harriet Selby area this week, I think you got to look at them as a possible contender in 9B, right with Gayville, Vollen, and Avon. These tough games, 9B teams don't have a lot of tough games against the 9A and the 9AA ranked teams. This will be a huge test for Potter County to see where they sit in that big 9B mess right now. Let's move on to question and answer. We got a couple questions in this week. We picked one from Nick Rosas. He says, is T-Area the best team in the state? And by looking at his Instagram account, it looks like Nike, I said Nick, but it's Nike. Looks like you play for T. So trying to test us on this one. Is T area the best team in the state, Michael?
I don't think it's fair to say that.
I don't think it's fair either.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say though, because they obviously don't play in AAA with all those big schools. So and they also haven't had a cross-class matchup like Pierre has.
Right. They
So
actually have an 11A matchup. They don't have any AAA games.
yeah, as far as dominance within their class, I don't even know if you could say that as well, because I think DeSmet is probably up there as well, and then Winter, and it's like there's a lot of teams that are dominating their respective classes as well. So I mean, T has clearly a lot of playmakers, and they do a really, really good job running the ball and sticking to their game plan and just keeping people off the scoreboard. But at the same time, can you really say that they're the best team in the state before we even know if they're the best team in AA? They haven't played Pierre yet, and obviously, as we've discussed earlier, I'm pretty high on Pierre and what they could do. So, I think there's a lot that we need to learn about T before we could call them the best team in the state, let alone the best team in AA.
I think that's an interesting question, Nike. If I was to have a rankings regardless of class, like take classes out and say who are the best teams in the state, I still have Harrisburg number 1, I still have Brandon Valley number 2, and then it's really tough for me to separate where would T be if they're week in, week out playing teams like Lincoln and Roosevelt. I mean, I think on a given Friday they could maybe beat one of those teams, but a full schedule, I think they've got a couple losses right now in AAA.
Yeah, and because obviously we're comparing the teams that are going undefeated in AAA. So it's hard to say that you could put T area in AAA, especially I mean, give credit to T. They're up a class from last year.
Oh yeah,
and they're dominating that class.
School in
so
AA right now.
I mean, if you gotta bet on any team to come up from a smaller class and do really well, I mean T has kind of shown over the past couple of years that they could do that.
Yeah, no disrespect.
Yeah, of course not.
No disrespect, but just best team in the state.
But just as you said, like full schedule. You see a couple losses on the schedule there, and we're comparing them to Harrisburg, Brandon Valley, who really, they might not have any losses on their schedule.
Right.
So, you can't really put them over there, but within some of those like kind of mid-tier teams in AAA, I mean, they could play with them, absolutely. And, that's no disrespect for those teams either, because I still think I would expect, any AAA team.
Yeah, we've seen Brookings play with Washington for a while. We've seen Pierre had a lead on Harrisburg early in that game earlier this year. Brandon Valley gets their chance at a AA team with Mitchell this week. These AA, AAA matchups are not, you don't mail them in. They're not that big of a difference between those classes. But yeah, it's a stretch to say that they would be the number 1 team overall. All right, what are we covering this week, Michael? What do you got on the radar for Argus Leader Media?
Yeah, so I'm going to be at Roosevelt, Washington. I believe that's 6 p.m. Friday.
Yep.
So that's going to be a really good game. As we discussed earlier, it's two teams that love to run the ball and love to keep the opposing offense from getting the ball. So, that's it's going to be sort of competing playing styles, and this is a really big test for Roosevelt because they obviously were able to do that against the dynamic, almost like one play offense in Jefferson, where Jefferson can get a touchdown from basically any point of the field. So it's easy to kind of take the ball out of their hands and limit them in that regard. But if Washington wants to sort of play their same game, this sort of shows like how good Roosevelt's game plan can be, and whether or not it holds up against teams that are trying to prevent them from doing the exact same thing.
Really excited for that game. That's going to be a lot of fun. At Midco, we've got a 7 o'clock start between Del Rapids and Madison. We haven't done a game in 11A yet this year. I'm really excited to see how this game shapes up. Madison so far number 1 in the year. Del Rapids hanging on in the top 5. If they can challenge Madison, I think that makes this a really fun game. So tune in. Tom Neiman and I on the call for that one. And then, of course, Varsity Sports Live at 10:30 every week. You can check out highlights from across North and South Dakota on the week. I think we did it. Michael, we'll be back next week, and we'll be talking about the last regular season game for some of these small schools. And we'll also be taking a look at what the playoffs will look like if the playoffs started next week when you watch this on Football Insiders. We'll see you then.